Welcome to The Beat. I'm Antonia Hilton in tonight for Ari Melber. We start tonight with a consequential ruling from the Supreme Court in the birthright citizenship case. The court handing Donald Trump a major win, restricting the ability of lower courts to block his executive orders nationwide, specifically his ban on birthright citizenship, which has been stopped by every federal judge who encountered it. Said more plainly by these outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, this now limits the power of judges to stop Trump. The 6-3 decision, no surprise, was split along ideological lines. Trump appointee Amy Coney Barrett, writing for the majority, quote, "When a court concludes that the executive branch has acted unlawfully, the answer is not for the court to exceed its power too," adding that nationwide injunctions will be limited only in cases where they are, quote, "broader than necessary," meaning Trump's birthright citizenship ban will likely take effect in the 28 states that have not challenged the measure. Justices Sonia Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown Jackson, in separate scathing dissents, calling it, quote, "an attack and existential threat to the rule of law." Justice Sotomayor accusing the Trump administration of, quote, gamemanship, admonishing her colleagues for, quote, playing along and disregarding, quote, basic principles of equity. And Justice Jackson with a dire warning, quote, "Executive lawlessness will flourish. Eventually, executive power will become completely uncontainable, and our beloved constitutional republic will be no more." Democratic lawmakers today are already slamming this decision.
The court has created a situation which we will not be able to easily unscramble. And secondly, they played right into the hands of Donald Trump.
The Supreme Court, the conservative court, trying to soothe his political ego, said, "Oh, well, we'll give you a procedural win on the equitable power of district courts," but he's going to continue to lose on the substance.
Joining me now is Leah Littman, law professor with the University of Michigan, co-host of the Strict Scrutiny podcast, and author of New York Times bestseller, Lawless: How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. And Ankush Khardori, former federal prosecutor and senior writer with Politico. Thank you both so much for being here tonight. Leah, I'll begin with you. Were you at all surprised by this decision?
Unfortunately not. Based on the oral argument, it sounded like the Republican justices were willing to give the Trump administration a major win in allowing the administration to escape from what has been the most effective and powerful tool that lower courts have to ensure the administration is actually in compliance with the law. And unfortunately, this decision just follows a pattern of this court and specifically the Republican justices allowing the Trump administration and Republican presidents in general out from under the law and just giving them a free pass to violate laws they don't like.
Ankush, earlier today, we saw the Attorney General, President Trump, speak at length with reporters, speaking incredibly confidently, describing this as a complete and total win. And I want to play some sound of Attorney General Pam Bondi, specifically sort of suggesting that come October, they believe they're going to win the whole thing on birthright citizenship. Take a listen.
So birthright citizenship will be decided in October in the next session by the Supreme Court, unless it comes down in the next few minutes. That will be decided in October in the next session.
Ankush, is that even accurate? And then is this the complete victory that they believe it is?
Well, if she's suggesting it will be in October, she has no way of knowing that. It may be in the next term of the Supreme Court's term, which perhaps is what she was referring to. It was a striking press conference, I have to say, and I agree with Professor Littman. It was not particularly a surprise, but it was a major victory. But it was still sort of striking to see them just go on television and take a victory lap like this. It is a major victory. I would just point out that there are a few caveats that are worth keeping in mind as people sort of follow the litigation going forward. So first, the court did not resolve the standing of the states that have challenged the executive order. So there's still some chance that the states may be entitled to nationwide injunctions to protect their interests. That remains to be seen. Second, the court said that class action vehicles are still available. I'm quite skeptical, I have to be honest, that those are a good fit for a situation like this. But we've
Why is
already
that?
seen that because there are very rigorous requirements for class actions in this country, including commonality and all sorts of legal requirements that require representatives to be lead plaintiffs to be representative of entire classes. And this is a situation where we could have people in multiple different sorts of situations that are impacted by this order. And the Supreme Court for years now has been making it harder for people to bring class action. So I found it a little galling, quite honestly, for them to be acting like this is an adequate substitute when everyone on that court knows that it's become much harder to file class actions in recent years. And then third, this does not apply to the birthright citizenship case, but the court did not resolve whether courts have the ability to set aside executive agency actions under the Administrative Procedures Act. Many of the injunctions that have been issued against the Trump administration since the start of the term have also been issued under the APA. Now, that is probably going to be the next front in this battle, but the ruling today technically does not disturb those. So in that respect, I think perhaps they oversold the victory here because it's not like a clean win for them.
Leah, do you think we're likely to see a sort of patchwork system of laws and rights in the United States? I mean, are we going to see a country in which, if you live in a red state, you have a very different set of rights than if you live in blue states? Are we going back to something like separate and unequal?
I think we are. I think we are already living in that world. Ever since the Supreme Court overruled Roe versus Wade, we have already been living in a country with a patchwork of protections where people have rights in some places and not in others. And I think this decision is only going to exacerbate that because while the Supreme Court held open the possibility for obtaining nationwide injunctions in some cases, there's no question that this decision will limit their availability. And so what that means is for some Trump administration policies that are wildly illegal, that courts have determined are indeed unlawful, if Republican-led states didn't challenge those policies, well, then the Trump administration is probably going to be able to implement those policies in those states as to people who, for whatever reason, were not able to find a lawyer and challenge the policy as applied to themselves. This is creating what Justice Jackson called an oral argument, a catch-me-if-you-can system, where you can only hold the executive branch accountable to the law if you personally manage to sue them and prevent them from violating your rights and violating the law in your case.
Ankush, I just spent the other day hours out on the streets of New York with people protesting under the banner of No Kings, very concerned about the expansion of power in the executive branch. Do you see this as part of sort of that pattern, that direction that our country, our system seems to be moving?
Unfortunately, I do think it's consistent with that view. I mean, if this had come down in a totally different context or a vacuum, there would be arguments in favor on both sides of this question of nationwide injunctions. But it is the particular context in which this arises that I think is so striking. And because as Justice Sotomayor pointed out, every court that's addressed this issue has concluded that it's unconstitutional. Every serious academic or legal observer who's considered the issue has concluded the executive order is unconstitutional. And yet you have the majority kind of acting like none of that matters. I mean, explicitly telling us that none of that matters actually to their resolution of the case and making no effort. I mean, this I found really striking, making no effort to consider the practical implications in this context, this particular birthright citizenship executive order. I mean, there are very, very serious stakes here. In the worst case scenario, if this doesn't get blocked sort of in a very comprehensive way, we could have children born in this country stateless, which is a shocking possibility and a very, very unsettling one. And those people could be deported to who knows where.
Leah, do you think that pregnant women in this country, in this moment, should be concerned about this and what the practical ramifications of this could look like in the coming months?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt that the civil rights organizations that challenge this executive order are scrambling to try to ensure that this administration is not actually going to be able to implement it. They have already refiled a case as a class action and asked for an emergency restraining order for a court to be issued expeditiously. That being said, there is no guarantee that courts are actually going to reissue what are, in effect, nationwide injunctions. There's also no guarantee that this Supreme Court Court would allow what are effectively nationwide injunctions to be issued in this case. I think the justices have revealed themselves to be quite hostile to the Reconstruction Amendments and the civil rights that they guarantee. It was last year that the Supreme Court told us states can't actually enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which prohibits people from holding office if they were engaged in insurrection or rebellion. And just now, they selected this case involving the very first sentence of the 14th Amendment, the foundation of a multiracial democracy at the heart of Reconstruction. They chose this case as the opportunity to really strike a death blow for courts' ability to hold the administration accountable to the law. And I think the fact that this court has a really disturbing pattern of attacking the Reconstruction Amendments and the civil rights should make everyone extremely concerned.
I think many Americans are extremely concerned tonight. Leah Littman, Ankush Khardori, thank you both so much for your insight tonight. Still ahead, Trump's mega bill sputters as Republicans scramble. Also, acclaimed writer Evan Osnos on the super rich, inequality, Jeff Bezos, and all those mega yachts. And later, progressives energized after that stunner in New York City. I have a special guest coming on. But first, historian Jon Meacham on the Supreme Court ruling. We're back in just 90 seconds. We have more on this massive decision from the Supreme Court, which has major implications for our system of government and Constitution as we know it, limiting the court's ability to check the president. As the New Republic puts it, quote, the Supreme Court picks Trump over the rule of law. Slate saying it, quote, could not be more disastrous. A piece in the LA Times calling it, quote, stunning and tragic. Justice Sotomayor slamming the decision in her dissent as, quote, nothing less than an open invitation for the government to bypass the Constitution. Joining me now is Jon Meacham, presidential historian, Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer. He served as an informal advisor to former President Biden, and he has written an introduction to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, making him the perfect guest for us tonight. Jon, thank you for being here. Democrats, of course, have spent the day saying that this is a catastrophic step toward authoritarianism. What does this ruling mean for our democracy, in your view?
I think it's a prelude. I think this is the first chapter of what could be, as the year goes on, as the next term goes on, a far more severe and serious crisis, which would be an attack, a frontal attack on the 14th Amendment, which is foundational to rebuilding the country after the Civil War, but not rebuilding it in the way it was, but actually trying to realize the implications of the Declaration of Independence. It was an attempt to not create a caste of people who would be less than. One of the many dark moments on the road to the Civil War was the Dred Scott decision in 1857, when Roger Taney, a few days after he had sworn in James Buchanan in 1857, ruled that Black people were simply not included in when all men were created equal, as Jefferson put it, and as the framers interpreted it, which was one of the great tragic hours in American history. And the 14th Amendment, as well as the cataclysm of the Civil War, was an attempt to actually live up to what the Declaration of Independence said, what the mission statement, written by people who looked like me, but who did not, in fact, act on it, what that sentence should truly mean. And so today is a disturbing prelude to a larger decision that may come. And so I think all acts of citizenship at this hour should be to encourage as many people as possible to understand what the 14th Amendment is. It sounds dorky, but a lot of dorky things are essential, and this is one of them.
Well, one of the things that we heard the president say in the press conference earlier today was that this whole thing was really originally just for the children of slaves. That those are the only people that they had in mind at the time when this was established. Is that true? And what does that comment tell you about the way this administration views our Constitution?
Well, the Constitution is so it's a fascinating argument, as you know. There is a conservative movement called originalism that attempts to under to apply the Constitution only in the ways in which the people at that particular hour meant it. There's the other argument, which is that it is a living document. Or Chief Justice Warren said, judges cannot simply be interpreters; they are also participants in an unfolding life of the nation. I'm paraphrasing there, but if you act as if only that letter of the law matters, then you are foreclosing a large part of what the American Revolution was fought for. And this may sound grand, but it has the virtue of being true. The American Revolution was fought in many ways for reason, for the workings of the mind, the workings of natural law, the conscience of a people and a country to go to higher ground, to make progress, not simply to be static, but to be kinetic. And that's what, in many ways, the Declaration was about. It's what, in many ways, the Constitution is about. It's the reason we had an amendment function in the Constitution. Is democracy is supposed to be an unfolding conversation that ideally leads us, in the words of the preamble, to a more perfect union. We're never going to make it perfect because we're on this side of paradise, but more perfect should be the goal. And so originalism, in many ways, is a very convenient way for someone to justify what they want to do without taking into account the unfolding workings of conscience. And so I think that in many ways, what we have to face here at this hour is that American democracy, as we have understood it, certainly since 1965, right? I mean, well, one thing to remember is we're about to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the country. We're really only about as old as 1965, because that's when we truly became a multiracial democracy with the passage both of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and the Immigration and Naturalization Act in 1965, which undid incredibly restrictive legislation that had passed in the isolationist and nativist 1920s. So we are a young, developing democracy here. And I think that should put all of us on our guard, not to be hyperbolic, not to, think that the doom is at hand, but as the great 18th century phrase had it, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. So we need to learn as much as we can about the 14th Amendment. We need to learn as much as we can about Reconstruction, what we got right, what we got wrong, and then try to figure out what is both the reasonable and just thing to do.
John Meacham, very grateful as always. You are a light and clarity in some dark and confusing times. We're grateful for your voice tonight.
Thank you.
Coming up, a special guest on a progressive stunner and what it means for Democrats trying to beat the MAGA movement. Also tonight, Republicans in D.C. on their heels as Trump's mega bill teeters. Plus, the New Yorker's Evan Osnos on Jeff Bezos' inequality and yachts. Donald Trump's mega bill is sputtering amid public backlash to its giveaways to the super rich. Now Republicans scrambling to save it from GOP defections, with a vote possibly happening this weekend. The New York Times calling the bill more regressive than any major law in decades. Massive tax breaks to the wealthy, while around 15 million people would stand to lose their health care. Acclaimed New Yorker writer Evan Osnos is here with us. He's been writing about inequality for a long time. The real-world backlash to exorbitant wealth on display in Venice right now, where the $50 million wedding of Jeff Bezos is sparking protests. This banner reads, if you can't rent Venice, or if you can rent Venice for your wedding, you can pay more taxes. The super rich arriving in style on their mega yachts, like Bezos' own $500 million yacht. It's longer than a football field. Other yachts also arriving, these owned by an Amazon investor and the owner of the Jacksonville Jaguars. That's what's happening overseas. Here in the US, though, Americans opposing Trump's bill and its giveaways to the rich by 21 points. Joining me, Evan Osnos, writer with The New Yorker. His book, The Haves and Have-Yachts, dispatches on the ultra-rich. Evan, look, Republicans are scrambling to push this enormous tax cut and sort of reshaping of the social safety net through, while we have this split screen with many of our celebrities and well-known ultra-rich arriving to party it up this weekend. What does this moment tell you about what we've become as a country?
You know, when you watch those scenes out of Venice, Antonia, I'm reminded of one astonishing fact, which is that the 400 richest Americans today have an effective tax rate that is half of what it was for them 50 years ago. While for the bottom 90% of Americans, their tax rates haven't budged or, in fact, have gone up a little bit. Take the case of Jeff Bezos. I mean, in his case, and there are many like him, if you have the benefit of tax advice or of lawyers who can help you do this, you can actually engineer your finances to the point that when he already had $18 billion, according to ProPublica, he paid so little in income that he received so little in income, he paid so little in tax that he actually qualified for a child tax credit. That's a system that doesn't make sense. And the bill that you see in Congress right now, in fact, would establish and extend and broaden many of those provisions in a way that I think has really alarmed people.
That bill, the more people hear about it, the more they seem to dislike it. But at the same time, Republicans do not, in many cases, seem very afraid of being held accountable by those same voters, of having to answer for this when the midterms come. Are we at a point in our system where it simply doesn't seem to matter?
You know what I think is actually happening, Antonio, is there's an old saying that the taxes are almost deliberately complex. They're made to seem so bewildering and incomprehensible that there was a senator, Carl Levin, used to call them "my eyes glaze over" bills, MIGOs, because they were almost designed to make people tune out. But I think at a certain point, and this is in some ways what a spectacle like what we're seeing in Venice drives home, is that for people, this becomes more than abstract. Look, half of American adults today say they can't afford a $1,000 emergency expense. I think people will tell you, this is pretty clear in surveys, that they're more pessimistic about their personal financial condition than they were even during the financial crisis. There is the accumulated effect of a precarious sensation. And I think that there are certainly members, Republican members in Congress, who are banking quite simply on the fact that this bill is so big, that it's so encompassing, that it will blind people to the details within. But I think that's all the more reason why you're seeing places like the Center for American Progress that are calling this explicitly the largest transfer of wealth from the working class to the ultra rich in the nation's history. The details matter, and the details are pretty astonishing.
We have some sound from Jeff Bezos defending his wealth. I want you to take a listen and react on the other side.
So instead of the Forbes list, it ranks you by your own wealth. So, Amazon's market cap is 2.3 trillion today. I own about, 200 billion-ish of it. So if you take 2.3 billion and subtract out the piece I kept from myself, then, I've created something like 2.1 trillion of wealth for other people. That should put me pretty high on some kind of list.
Do you think most Americans are buying that kind of argument at this point? Or has greed kind of just become a core part of our country's identity?
in some ways, he's just described the paradox we're living in. We're living at a time of enormous wealth creation. I mean, the advent of new technologies, of new businesses that didn't exist a generation ago. You might say, well, this is a time when Americans should be living better than ever. In fact, you've seen the number of billionaires go up from 66 in 1990 to more than 800 today. The problem is the hourly median wage in this country has barely budged 20% in that same period of time. So people just don't feel it. Yes, there's been wealth creation for shareholders of Amazon. But if you're part of the vast majority of Americans who are not beneficiaries of that, you're looking at the government and you're saying, frankly, I don't want to give up on the dream of getting rich. I just want to create a tool and a pathway that allows me to be able to get there too. So I think we're reaching a point right now. And in some ways, the spectacle that we're seeing, which some people enjoy watching the sites, it's hard, not to be a killjoy about it. It is also in its own way a story of American economics and politics about what brought us to this point. It's worth remembering, a decade ago when George and Amal Clooney were in Venice getting married, there weren't protests. People really weren't all that agitated about it. Here we are today. We're at a moment where people are feeling acutely vulnerable economically. And this bill, if it is left untouched, would extend many of the feelings and the system that has made it hard for people to feel safe, secure, and healthy.
Evan Osnos, thank you so much. And for anyone who hasn't read his book, it is really good. Get a copy of it. Still ahead, a new university leader caving to Trump's demands. We'll bring you the latest. But first, new lessons for Democrats nationwide as a rising star in New York City attempts to unseat New York's mayor. A special guest on that. Those shocking results in the Democratic primary for New York mayor are reverberating far beyond the 5 boroughs. Tuesday's winner, Zoran Mamdani, is now pivoting to November's general election, where he will face the current mayor, Eric Adams, now running as an independent. Adams coming out swinging, attacking Mamdani during an appearance on Fox News. Here's how Mamdani described that dynamic.
I think what Eric Adams is looking to distract from is the fact that we won the very neighborhoods that he won in single digits in 2021. We won them by double digits. Bed-Stuy, Harlem, Washington Heights. Our coalition is one that looks in some ways like his, but unlike what he did over the last 4 years, we're actually going to deliver on our promises.
The numbers seem to be on Mamdani's side. Gothamist reports that Mamdani won at least 432,000 first-choice votes in this year's Democratic mayoral primary, while Eric Adams won 289,000 first-choice votes in 2021. And it's the makeup of Mamdani's voters that might intrigue Democrats. NBC News highlighting Mamdani showed strength with young voters across the city, and yet some D.C. Democrats are still reluctant to embrace him right now. Joining me now is former Democratic Congressman from New York, Jamal Bowman. All right, so much to dig into here. Thank you for being at the table with me tonight. So putting his policies aside for a second, I guess I want to understand why you think the Democratic establishment is so hesitant to embrace someone who has a couple good things going for him. Young people like him.
Mm-hmm.
He has charisma. He can talk publicly and seems to be able to motivate people who just explicitly told this party that they felt shut out, excluded, unrepresented in the most recent, incredibly consequential election.
Mm-hmm.
So for some of those reasons alone, why do some of them seem so hesitant to even work with the guy?
Yeah, the Democratic Party, unfortunately, is being completely controlled by big money in politics. Big money has co-opted the party. And so you have Zoran Mamdani, who's running for the working class, running on an affordability platform, talking about freezing the rent, universal childcare, fast and free busing, et cetera, lowering grocery prices. And it makes the establishment uncomfortable. I mean, we're talking about an establishment. Many of them have been in office for a very long time. Again, they've made their decision to allow big money to influence their campaigns and how we govern in Washington and across the country. So now you have someone who's young, like you said, charismatic. He literally ran circles around
He
Governor
walked
Cuomo.
down the entirety of Manhattan.
Correct. And his entire campaign, it was him outworking the competition by a mile. And he's doing something, and he has done something that the establishment doesn't know how to do. He's inspiring young people. And he's bringing out first-time primary voters. That's exactly what the establishment should be doing. But young people aren't going to buy into the Democratic establishment as long as we continue to allow big money to corrupt our democracy.
And big money, of course, is a major part of Democrats' criticism of Trump and the entire MAGA movement right now. Crypto dealings, I mean, the entire thing. I think it's hard for a lot of young people right now to make sense of their ability to criticize it over there, but not to self-reflect a bit over here.
That's right.
We've seen Republicans attack him. A lot of the attacks have been incredibly racist and Islamophobic, and some would maybe say that given the direction of things, they're not so surprised by that. But some of the comments we've heard from Democrats have been a bit surprising. You know, a senator here in New York speaking to Brian Lehrer this week, saying or suggesting essentially that he's supported global jihad. Are you surprised that it has gotten to that point where comments like that have been made about Mamdani?
I'm not surprised, unfortunately. You know, there's so much ignorance toward and around the Muslim religion and Islam as a religion. People from different backgrounds, brown people from different backgrounds. The word socialism is weaponized as some kind of, you know, anti-American thing. And, you know, Senator Gillibrand and others seem to have fallen victim to that level of ignorance and miseducation. I mean, there are thousands, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Muslims in New York State. Senator Gillibrand represents them too.
To be fair to her, she did acknowledge later through her team that she misspoke when she said that.
But
about
you're a New York State senator, a United States senator. You cannot misspeak because it's dangerous when you misspeak. And so we have a responsibility, and Zohran's been very clear about this responsibility. He's here to serve all New Yorkers. He's here to protect all New Yorkers. He said it over and over and over again. And ignorance leads to fear, it leads to hate, it leads to misunderstanding. Zohran has said, I'm meeting people in their community, I'm listening and learning, and I'm here to govern for you. Gillibrand needs to take a page out of that book and govern for all New Yorkers.
What would you like to see Mamdani now do heading into this general election, especially when it comes to some of the issues, you know, the Jewish community here in New York, concerned about the climate, not just in the city, but around the country right now, and eager, I think, for dialogue with him? What would you advise him to do in this moment?
Continue to do what he has been doing. He's been in every corner of the city multiple times. And now that he's won the primary and he's headed to the general, continue to be in every corner of the city, listening and learning and engaging and figuring out how to govern for everyone. I mean, he got the second most votes from the Jewish community in this primary. So yes, there are some in the Jewish community who are hesitant, but he got the second most votes, I believe, after Brad Lander. And so there's always more learning to do when you're in leadership, and he's about to do it, which is going to be exciting.
Really quickly, do you think the Democratic Party is going to learn some lessons from this race?
I hope so. They got to. Everyone should get on board and endorse Zohran right now, because our party, our approval numbers are 20-something%. We're on life support. We allowed Trump back in the office again, and our democracy is on the precipice of falling apart. The Democratic Party has to save American democracy. And leaning into Zohran and others who are stars in our party, we got a bunch of stars right here in New York. Chia Seig, Tiffany Caban, AOC, on and on and on. Uplift them. We have to bridge the gap, the generational divide. That's happening in the party between the older, more establishment, and the younger. We have to bridge that gap to save our country.
Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Your insight is always incredible. Up next, UVA's president resigning amid Trump's escalating attacks on higher education. The Trump administration escalating attacks on universities. University of Virginia President James Ryan announcing today he will resign after facing pressure from Donald Trump's Justice Department. Ryan stepping aside to resolve the DOJ's investigation into the school's diversity practices after they threatened to withhold hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding if he did not quit. Does that sound familiar? Other universities have already been targeted by the Trump administration and caved to its demands. But some schools, like Harvard, have fought back by filing legal challenges in court. Joining me now is Jason Johnson, politics professor at Morgan State University and MSNBC contributor. Jason, it's great to see you. UVA is the envy of many public schools around the country and world. To be able to force out a school leader beloved by much of the student body and alums like yourself,
Right.
What does this represent to you?
This is authoritarianism. Without question. We've said this about how this administration or really regime operates, but the idea of forcing out university presidents who do not want to abide by whatever sort of ideological motivations come out of this administration, that's what we talk about in Turkey. That's what we've talked about in places like Brazil and Argentina. And Antonio, I want to make this really clear. Not only has Jim Ryan been a very popular president amongst the students, he's done a good job, right? The university has saved money. The university has improved its rankings in U.S. News and World Report. It was always a public ivy up there with Berkeley and University of Michigan and Ohio State, but it is now, I think, like ranked second in the country for best bang for your buck. So this had nothing to do with whether or not he was doing a good job. It has to do with an internal coup by members of the Board of Visitors at the University of Virginia who wanted to get rid of him because they thought he was too woke, working with former UVA alumni who are in this administration who want to tear down universities because they know that'll be the birthplace of resisting this authoritarian regime.
What do you think they want to remake UVA into? What is the end goal here?
I want to sort of semi-quote Jamel Bouie, who is another UVA alum whose work I read on a regular basis. UVA used to be a finishing school for rich guys' sons in the 60s and 70s, right? It's where rich white people would send their kids who weren't going to accomplish anything, but they wanted a nice school. This is a university that did not allow women or black people into the undergraduate population until like 1971, 1972. That's what this administration wants to return it to. They want UVA to be the old Southern school that it used to be, where people sit around and drink mint juleps and harass women, and the black people there are the only ones, the only black people there are the people who are serving folks. That's what they want. But here's the thing, Antonia, it's not just about UVA. The attacks on Harvard, the attacks on Columbia, the attacks on NYU, I always knew that those big, well-endowed universities would be able to defend themselves. But those attacks were meant to make state schools like UVA capitulate faster. They were meant to go after the University of Akron's and the UT Austins, the places that have a less financial and legal ability to fight against this regime.
Well, speaking of Harvard, the Trump administration has indicated that the school is negotiating with them once again, that there may be an agreement at some point, although we know the legal battle continues. At this point, are people in higher education looking to that one school to fight this out until the very end for the next 3.5 years?
No, I mean, look, this is how any bully works, right? You go in and you punch the biggest kid in the cafeteria and everybody else is just going to give you their sandwiches, right? It doesn't matter if Harvard is able to survive the bad faith attacks from the Trump administration. Every other school in the country knows they're not Harvard. Every other school in the country knows they don't have that kind of endowment. And if you can get university presidents to step down, and let's be clear, Jim Ryan, I've talked about how he was popular, but he was going to step down after next year anyway. So he was like, look, I'll leave early. But what that allows for is Glenn Youngkin and other conservative governors to say, well, wait a minute, if I can kneecap, UVA can get kneecapped this way, well, what's Abbott going to do in Texas with UT Austin? And what's Brian Kemp going to do in Georgia? And what have we already seen at FAMU in Florida under DeSantis, right? That's the goal here. So whether or not people are looking to Harvard as sort of holding the line, there are going to be state schools throughout the country, especially with Republican governors who know that they're going to be under threat next.
You know, I have heard the same from virtually every leader in higher education that I've spoken to in the course of covering this. They are very concerned about what is to come over the course of the next 3 years. Jason Johnson, thank you so much for joining tonight. Coming up, an exclusive. One of the highest profile detainees in Donald Trump's immigration crackdown is speaking out. Some of that interview airs for the very first time after this break. Now to an exclusive with one of the highest profile detainees in Donald Trump's immigration crackdown, Mahmoud Khalil, speaking out just days after being released after 104 days in a notorious Louisiana immigration detention center. ICE agents arresting the Columbia University student in March for his role organizing protests over the war in Gaza on campus. His story sparked a national outcry. We sat down with Mr. Khalil and his wife, Dr. Noor Abdallah. This is their first ever interview as a couple. They talked about what it was like for each of them after their baby Dean was delivered.
I walked upstairs with Dean by myself. We walked into the apartment and it was like quiet and it's not how I imagined walking into my apartment with my new baby. I don't know. I think all the emotions kind of hit me at that point. I just wanted him to be there.
I lost like one of the divine moments with my wife and son. I mean, the first time was literally like 3:30 a.m. Moments after like the delivery. I just heard him crying. And that literally like got me in the heart. And I think it's just unbelievable that someone had the cruelty to take that moment from me.
You can catch the rest of this interview on the weekend primetime at 6 p.m. tomorrow. So that does it for me.